Imagine you're standing in a forest 40,000 years ago. It's cold, the kind of cold that gets into your joints and doesn't leave. You're hungry, your feet hurt, and somewhere behind you, a group of stocky, broad-faced beings is watching you from the tree line. They're not wolves, they're not bears, they're people, sort of. And here's the thing, they were here first, long before you, long before your kind showed up with your fancy tools and your campfire stories, and your suspiciously aggressive expansion across every single continent on Earth. Those beings, gone now, every single one of them. And you, well, you made it. Your species made it. Homo sapiens, the last human standing. But why? That's not a small question. That's maybe one of the most important questions in the entire history of life on this planet. Because it wasn't just one other human species that disappeared, it was several. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, Homo naledi. There was a whole crowd of us once. A whole messy, complicated, surprisingly large family of human beings stumbling around this planet trying to survive. And now, just us. One species. Alone. How does that happen? How do you go from a world with multiple human species to a world with exactly one? Was it us? Did we do it? Did we walk into Europe and Asia and basically just ruin everything for everyone else? Or was it something deeper? Climate, competition, bad luck, a fatal flaw baked into their biology from the start? The answer, as it turns out, is not simple. It never is. But it is fascinating. And it involves volcanoes, interspecies romance, children who were part Neanderthal, and a level of prehistoric drama that absolutely no one talks about enough. Let's go back, way back. For most of human prehistory, the Earth was not a one-species operation. Around 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, but we were not alone, not even close. At roughly the same time, give or take a few tens of thousands of years, which in geological time is basically a Tuesday, there were Neanderthals thriving across Europe and Western Asia. There were Denisovans ranging across Eastern Asia and potentially much further. There was Homo erectus, one of the longest surviving human species in history, still hanging on in parts of Asia. And in the islands of Southeast Asia, there were the so-called hobbits, Homo floresiensis, a tiny, small-brained species that managed to live on the island of Flores for an almost absurdly long time. The world was busy, humanly speaking. And it wasn't just those four. Homo naledi, discovered in South Africa in 2013, had a brain the size of an orange, but was apparently burying its dead in deep cave system, a behavior we associate with much larger-brained species. Homo heidelbergensis may have been the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans, a sort of evolutionary grandparent who didn't survive to see what became of its descendants. There were possibly others we haven't found yet, species known only from a single tooth or a fragment of jaw, nameless ghosts in the fossil record. At various points in the last 500,000 years, there may have been as many as 6 or 7 distinct human species alive simultaneously. Think about that. 6 or 7 different kinds of people walking the earth at the same time, none of them knowing the others existed in many cases. All of them building fires and raising children and trying to figure out where their next meal was coming from. These weren't primitive, shuffling creatures of pure instinct. Neanderthals buried their dead. They used pigments, possibly for body decoration. They made jewelry out of eagle talons, which, if you've ever seen an eagle talon, is an impressive choice. They controlled fire, they hunted megafauna, they cared for their injured. There's evidence of Neanderthal individuals who survived serious disabilities for years, meaning someone, other Neanderthals, was taking care of them. One famous individual, discovered at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, had a withered arm, a damaged eye socket, and severe arthritis. He lived to what would have been an old age for the time. He did not survive alone. These were not animals. They were people. Thinking, feeling, socially connected people, doing their absolute best in a very difficult world. So what happened to them? The short answer is Homo sapiens showed up. The long answer is it's complicated and honestly a little uncomfortable. When our ancestors began their big push out of Africa, starting seriously around 70,000 years ago and accelerating over the following tens of thousands of years, they didn't enter an empty world. They walked into territories that other humans had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years, and everywhere modern humans went, the local residents started disappearing within a geologically short period of time. This pattern is almost impossible to ignore. Neanderthals vanished around 40,000 years ago, shortly after Homo sapiens arrived in Europe in large numbers. Homo floresiensis disappeared around 50,000 years ago, right around the time modern humans are thought to have reached the region. Homo erectus in Java, gone. The timeline of extinction keeps matching the timeline of our arrival with an awkward consistency. Now, to be clear, this does not mean we ran around systematically hunting other humans. There's no archaeological evidence of mass Neanderthal graveyards or anything so cinematic. The process was almost certainly more mundane, and in some ways more tragic for that. Think about it in terms of resources. When modern humans moved into an area, they competed with the existing population for food, shelter, and territory. Homo sapiens were, by most evidence, better at long-range projectile weapons, throwing spears, atlatls, eventually bows. The ability to kill something from a distance without getting near enough to be hurt is a genuinely transformative advantage when your prey outweighs you by several hundred kilograms. They had more sophisticated social networks, which meant information spread faster. Who had found a new hunting ground where the mammoths were migrating? Which plants were edible in the new valley? They may have had more complex language. They almost certainly had larger and more connected trade networks, allowing them to acquire materials and tools from hundreds of kilometers away. Against all of that, existing human populations didn't stand much of a chance. Not because they were stupid, because the competition was simply too intense. And when a population gets squeezed out of the best territories, pushed into marginal environments, and reduced to small isolated groups, extinction tends to follow. Not with a bang, with a slow, quiet fade. That's a pattern we see again and again throughout history. Not just in human prehistory, but in nature at large. When two closely related species occupy the same ecological niche, one of them wins. Ecologists call it competitive exclusion. The loser doesn't always lose because they were weaker. Sometimes they just got unlucky. Sometimes they were in the wrong place when the rules changed. But here's where it gets even more interesting. We didn't just compete with Neanderthals. We also slept with them. Yes, that's a real thing that happened. Modern genetic analysis has made this uncomfortably clear. If you are of European or Asian descent, somewhere between 1 and 4% of your DNA is Neanderthal. Some populations in parts of Asia carry even more Denisovan DNA. There are people alive today, right now, reading the news, sitting in traffic, making bad financial decisions, who carry the genetic legacy of an extinct human species. That means there was a period, however brief or extended, when modern humans and Neanderthals were not just coexisting, they were interbreeding. They were having children who grew up in a world that had both fully Neanderthal and fully modern human communities, and who were biologically something in between. That's not a small thing. That's a profound thing. These were not just two competing species. They were close enough genetically and biologically to produce viable offspring, which raises a question that scientists have only recently started to take seriously. At what point does different species stop being a meaningful category when it comes to our prehistoric relatives? The answer matters, because it changes the story. It means the extinction of Neanderthals wasn't a clean replacement. It was a merger, a messy, incomplete, partial merger, where most of one group disappeared, but not entirely. Pieces of them survived. They're inside you right now. Neanderthal genes that affect your immune system, your metabolism, your risk for certain diseases. Some of those. Neanderthal gene variants actually proved useful. Populations that interbred with Neanderthals may have picked up adaptations to cold European climates faster than they could have evolved them independently. The Neanderthals were incorporated into the human story, whether they wanted to be or not. As for the Denisovans, they're even stranger. We've identified an entirely separate archaic human population almost entirely from DNA. The physical remains are a few teeth and a pinky bone. That's it. Everything else we know about them comes from their genetic signature in the modern human populations they interbred with. There are people in Tibet today who carry a Denisovan gene variant that helps their bodies process oxygen at high altitude. A gift from a people who vanished tens of thousands of years ago. Still useful, still present, still doing its job. Extinction, it turns out, is not always total. Now let's talk about climate, because no extinction story is complete without a good climate catastrophe. The period between 70,000 and 12,000 years ago was not a pleasant time to be alive. The Earth was swinging through dramatic climate shifts. Ice age is advancing, glaciers covering huge portions of the northern hemisphere, sea levels dropping by over 100 meters at certain points. Landscapes that were habitable one millennium were frozen tundra the next. And then the cycle would shift again, the ice would retreat, the vegetation would return, and the whole desperate scramble for territory and food would begin from a new starting position. For large-brained, adaptable, socially complex species, like modern humans, this was survivable. Difficult, but survivable. You could migrate, you could innovate, you could develop new technologies for hunting in cold environments, new strategies for finding food in unfamiliar landscapes. For species with smaller populations, more localized ranges, and less cognitive flexibility, these swings were potentially catastrophic. Neanderthals were adapted to cold European environments, yes, but they'd been through ice ages before and survived. What they hadn't faced before was all of that, plus the arrival of Homo sapiens at the same time. Climate stress, plus competitive pressure, plus small, fragmented populations is a recipe for extinction. It doesn't require anyone to be the villain. It doesn't require direct violence. It just requires enough pressure from enough directions at the same time, and populations that were already marginal don't recover. There's also the Toba catastrophe to consider, though this one is debated. Around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano in what is now Indonesia erupted on a scale so massive it may have triggered a volcanic winter lasting years. Ash layers from this eruption have been found across South Asia and East Africa. Sunlight would have been dramatically reduced. Temperatures dropped, food chains collapsed. Some researchers have argued this event nearly wiped out the entire human population, all species of humans everywhere. Modern genetic evidence suggests Homo sapiens went through a severe population bottleneck sometime in this era, meaning the total population may have dropped to just a few thousand individuals. A few thousand, out of which came every person alive today. Whether or not the Toba eruption was the direct cause, the evidence for a near-extinction event in our own species' history is hard to ignore. We came very close to not existing, and if we barely made it through, you can imagine what events like that did to species with smaller populations and less geographic spread. Then there are the island species, and they deserve their own moment. Homo floresiensis, the so-called Flores hobbit, is one of the most bizarre and wonderful discoveries in the history of paleoanthropology. Found on the island of Flores in Indonesia, these were tiny humans, about a meter tall, with brains roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, who were nevertheless making stone tools and hunting pygmy elephants. Let that sink in. A creature with a chimpanzee-sized brain hunting elephants, even pygmy ones, using tools it made itself. Whatever we think we understand about the relationship between brain size and intelligence, Homo floresiensis has something to say about it. They survived until at least 50,000 years ago, possibly more recently. How do you get a tiny human? The same way you get tiny elephants. And giant rats. Island biogeography. When large animals are isolated on islands with limited resources, they tend to shrink over generations. When small animals are isolated without predators, they tend to grow. Islands are evolutionary laboratories, and they produce strange results. Homo floresiensis is the result of an ancestral human population, probably Homo erectus, getting stranded on Flores and evolving in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years. They were a species, a whole species, tiny, tool-using, elephant-hunting, island-dwelling human beings, and then they disappeared. Homo luzonensis, found in the Philippines, is even more recently discovered and even more mysterious. A small-bodied species with a strange mixture of primitive and modern features that doesn't fit neatly into any existing category. We know almost nothing about them. They're represented by a handful of bone fragments and teeth. They were probably there for a long time, and then they weren't. The point is, the human family was enormous, and we've only just started to understand how enormous it was. Every decade, paleoanthropologists find something that rewrites what we thought we knew. New species, new timeline, new evidence of behavior we assumed was uniquely ours. The picture keeps getting more complicated, more crowded, more humbling. So what was the decisive advantage? If we're going to try to explain why Homo sapiens survived when everyone else didn't, what's the actual answer? Here's the most compelling hypothesis that emerges from the evidence: behavioral modernity. Starting around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, though the exact timing is debated, there appears to be a step change in how modern humans behaved. Suddenly, the archaeological record fills up with things that weren't there before at the same scale. Cave paintings, figurines, musical instruments, long-distance trade networks, highly specialized tools made from materials sourced far away, clothing tailored for specific climates, evidence of complex planning and symbolic thinking, not just reacting to the world, but modeling it, predicting it, reshaping it. What changed? One popular hypothesis points to a critical threshold in language complexity. The idea is that at some point, human language became recursive, meaning you could build sentences within sentences, express hypotheticals, plan for the future, talk about things that weren't right in front of you. And once you can do that, everything changes. You can coordinate with large groups of strangers, not just your immediate family. You can pass knowledge across generations in precise detail, so each generation starts a little further ahead than the last. You can plan a hunt that accounts for what the animals might do. You can develop a shared mythology, a story about who your people are and what they believe, that binds strangers together into cooperative units large enough to do things no small group could accomplish alone. You can innovate because you can describe a new idea in words precise enough for someone else to understand and build on. Other human species may not have had this, or they may have had earlier, less flexible versions of it. The gap between a language that can communicate mammoth that direction and one that can communicate if we wait until the herd crosses the river at the narrow point, which they usually do around midday based on patterns we've observed over the last 3 years, we can cut off the young ones from the rear. That gap is enormous, and it may have made all the difference. This is sometimes called the cognitive revolution. And if it happened, if there was a real threshold crossed somewhere in our evolutionary history, then it's the single most important event that ever happened to our species. More important than agriculture, more important than writing, because without it, none of those came later. There's a theory, uncomfortable but worth taking seriously, that asks whether we need to use the word genocide, not in the modern, intentional, politically charged sense, but in the practical sense. Did Homo sapiens systematically drive other other human populations to extinction, not through malice but through the ordinary mechanics of expansion, competition, and conflict, some researchers think the answer is yes. That small-scale violence between groups was a regular feature of the interactions between modern humans and Neanderthals. That raids, territorial conflicts, and the killing of individuals from competing groups happened, and that over thousands of years, these interactions added up. We do have some limited evidence of Neanderthal remains that show signs of violence, but we also have evidence of Homo sapiens being violent toward other Homo sapiens. It was a violent world, and everyone participated. The question isn't whether violence happened, it's whether it was systematic enough to be a primary driver of extinction. Most researchers think it was a contributing factor, not the main cause. The competitive pressures, resource depletion, habitat loss, reduced reproductive success as populations were fragmented, were probably more decisive than direct killing. But it would be dishonest to pretend violence played no role at all. When two groups of people with incompatible territorial needs encounter each other repeatedly over thousands of years, violence happens. It doesn't need to be organized, it doesn't need to be intentional genocide in any modern sense. It just needs to tip the odds a little further against a population that was already struggling. And there may also have been disease. This is speculative, but important. When modern humans emerged from Africa, they came with pathogens evolved in the African disease environment. Populations that had never been exposed to those pathogens would have had no immunity. It's the same dynamic that devastated indigenous American populations when Europeans arrived, not primarily through violence, but through disease. A population hit by a novel epidemic while also under competitive and climatic pressure is a population in serious trouble. Here's what it all adds up to. The disappearance of other human species wasn't one thing. It was everything at once. It was climate instability that squeezed already stressed populations. It was competition with a species that had hit on a particularly effective set of cognitive tools. It was the slow strangulation of small, isolated groups cut off from the resources they needed to survive. It was interbreeding that blurred the boundaries between populations and absorbed fragments of the vanishing into the expanding. It was disease. Possibly, modern humans emerging from Africa may have carried pathogens that other human species had no immunity to. It was bad luck in some cases and structural disadvantage in others, and underpinning all of it was a species, us, that had stumbled onto a way of organizing itself and its knowledge that was simply too powerful for the world it entered. Not morally superior, not physically superior, not even necessarily smarter in the way we usually mean that word, but cognitively networked in a way that compounded over time. The knowledge we could accumulate, share, and build on gave us an edge that widened with every generation, like compound interest, but for survival. The other human species didn't fail. They just ran into something unprecedented, something that none of the 4 billion years of evolution on this planet had produced before in quite the same configuration. And now they're gone. Except, as we said, they're not entirely gone. They're in your genome, in the particular shape of your immune response, in the proteins that help your body adapt to cold, in a gene variant in the Tibetan highlands that traces back to people we have almost no physical remains of. Fragments, scattered through a species that outlasted them, carrying parts of them forward without knowing it for tens of thousands of years. That's the story of the vanished humans. Not a clean story, not a heroic one, not one that makes Homo sapiens look particularly good. If we're being honest, we survived because we were better at surviving, and that's not the same as being better in any other sense. The Neanderthals were people. The Denisovans were people. The hobbits of Flores were people. Small-brained, tool-making, fire-lighting, community-maintaining people who lived and died and raised their children on this planet for hundreds of thousands of years before we showed up. They deserved more than a footnote. And maybe the most unsettling thought of all, the one that the fossil record keeps whispering if you listen closely enough, is this. We were not inevitable. We were one of several options. A draft. One experiment among many. And the experiment that succeeded wasn't necessarily the most deserving. It was the one that got the timing right, the tools right, the networks right, at exactly the right moment in a world that rewarded those specific advantages. The next time you find yourself feeling confident about the permanence of human civilization, about how obviously we were always going to end up here, building cities and launching satellites and making videos about extinct relatives, it's worth remembering that the Neanderthals looked out at their world and had no reason to believe they wouldn't always be there either. They had fire. They had community. They had tens of thousands of years of accumulated survival knowledge, and then they weren't.